I'm Britt Wray, and I'm a science writer and a broadcaster focusing on the emotional and psychological dimensions of the climate crisis. For the last 3 years, I've been writing a book, which is still forthcoming, called Generation Dread, which is about looking at these emotional, psychological dimensions of the climate crisis and understanding what we can do to harness them for the kinds of transformations that we need, as well as cope and find meaning and purpose in our lives, as Gwyneth very correctly pointed out, that many of us are struggling to get a handle on. So that's me in a nutshell, and I'd be very happy to take any questions later about any other work that I'm doing. A little bit about how I came to work on this topic is that in 2017, I had a soul-rocking awakening to the climate crisis. I had already appreciated it intellectually as someone who, has a degree in biology with a focus on conservation biology, and had always been paying attention to environmental news and understood that the threat was vast. But there was a real emotional quotient that came crashing over me 3 years ago that I had not had experience with before. It was not yet keeping me up at night. It was not yet something that I would break down and cry about in a state of grief as though someone I loved had died. This was completely new and surprising and quite shocking to me. I am not someone who had typically felt so emotional about things that were non-human. Well, of course it encapsulates human aspects, but I didn't really know what this intensity was doing to my life, how it was changing me, how I could get a hold of it, transform it into something beneficial, useful, positive. And it really started from, I believe, trying to get my head around what it would mean to have a child with my partner. This was the tipping point, when confronting data and scientific reports and articles on a constant basis, and then being in these conversations about trying to get pregnant. The dilemma there felt extremely painful, and I was not anticipating this response around something so important and intimate in my life. And so I put a post on Facebook one day, and I just said, has anyone out there felt stressed about raising children because of the climate crisis? And this was before it became, a pop culture topic that every single platform now has an op-ed on, which has happened. And academics are now studying reproductive anxiety and the climate crisis. And, cultural figures have come out to kind of support the legitimacy of these feelings. Back then it was still extremely disenfranchised, really no one talking about it. And to see the flurry of activity that post created, the most comments I've ever had on any kind of social media post really pointed out to me that there's something to brew. There's something going on. We're being psychologically impacted in a very intimate way by the climate crisis, and I wanted to find out more. So I set out to write a book, and the book would be a way by which I could understand these feelings and their positive attributes, the ways to cope, and provide a reflection of where society is at right now. And through the process of researching for the book, I've now, developed a whole suite of tools and ideas and kind of coping mechanisms for how we can confront the truth of our reality without turning away from it when it's very difficult to bear. Okay, I have a book forthcoming, as I mentioned, but in the meantime, I'm putting digests out on a free newsletter called Gen Dread. So you can sign up at gendread.substack.com if you would like to keep in touch with me and these ideas as they're unfolding. Let's just look at some trends of how we know that this is what's going on. In 2019, Oxford Languages reported a 4,290% increase in use of the term eco-anxiety in just that 1 year, highlighting an increase in the public interest in the mental health impacts of the climate crisis. In 2020, a national poll in the UK found that 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds are more worried about the climate crisis in that moment than they were just 1 year prior. This year, a national survey in the US found a shocking statistic, really, that 78% of American Gen Zers don't plan on having kids because of climate change, while 71% of millennials stated that climate change has already affected their mental health in a negative fashion. Meanwhile, groups like Birth Strike, who have recently been renamed to Grieving Parenthood in the Climate Crisis, and No Future, No Children, as a political pledge, have formed around the declaration that they're refusing to have kids because governments have made it unsafe for them to do so, and that they won't consider the option until governments take effective and appropriate, adequate climate action. And since 2017, we've seen a bold vision of hope with the rise of youth climate activists. And it's been wonderful and truly transformational in all ways that we need, of course, and that we want. But these youth activists also often say that they feel terrified and enraged as they're forced into positions of leadership since the adults themselves aren't doing it. Greta Thunberg, of course, has become an environmental icon, and she really put climate anxiety on the public discourse map in a very visible way by speaking explicitly about her experiences with it. And as you see often at these marches, various signs that reoccur, such as why are we studying for a future that we won't have, and you'll die of old age, we'll die of climate change. Really, these, of course, are political slogans that are designed to grab you and make you pay attention, but how could any child not feel that way when the World Health Organization issues reports, as it did this past February, that state that as the climate threat intensifies, there is no single nation on the planet that is adequately protecting children's health. So many eco-anxious people report this phenomenon of having woken up, it's this epiphany to the colossal scale of the threat, which then sends them into a grief-stricken process of mourning the future that they believed would come, which is a future of ecological stability, and that they now know that it won't. And this creates an internal fragmentation, a deep shattering, which sends them into a space of existential grief, fear, absolutely not knowing what to do with the immensity of that shock. Now, this seems to be a very difficult thing for typically privileged populations from the industrialized world, because these populations have generally not been exposed to existential threats. And so based on experience, their relative comfort means that they don't have that large store of existential resilience necessarily to rely on. Of course, things could have happened in their personal life that make that not the case. But I expect that in the years to come, we're going to see increasing numbers of typically privileged communities turning to the stories and wisdom of frontline communities or historically marginalized and oppressed communities who have long had to battle for survival in the midst of apartheid, systemic racism, colonization, you name it, in order to find the nuggets of guidance and truth and wisdom that they require for the years ahead. Of course, it describes something that's definitely surging in our society, but there's also things to look out for, such as that this term is coming from the global north predominantly, and it cannot adequately represent the turmoil that comes in places of the global south predominantly, where environmental violence has been reaping in ecosystems through time. And so just labeling a new form of distress on top of the environmental injustices that have already been there through colonization and kind of industrial extractive practices really minimizes the effects. And this is an excerpt here from my book, but as I think it really wraps it up. As journalist Abby Higgins writes in The New Republic, the sudden proliferation of collective mourning from citizens of the global north can obscure the stakes. Not the stakes as they have suddenly become, but the stakes as they always were. After all, I do not live in Turkana, Kenya, where she reports that a lake, which more than 300,000 people depend on, is drying up. To be sure, people like me are not mourning the loss of physical places as much as we are mourning the loss of the illusion that has kept our lives humming along, one where there was a guarantee that basic needs would be met. So regardless of that nuance, the distress is real, whether you're typically privileged or not. And in recent years, a whole field of climate-aware therapists have arisen to help people deal with the emotions and the feelings that come with being alive at this time. And they're collectively organized in places like the Climate Psychiatry Alliance and the Climate Psychology Alliances of the UK and North America, as well as Psychology for a Safe Climate in Australia. And they operate from a foundational belief that there is nothing pathological about feeling this sense of eco-anxiety, and rather that it is an appropriate reaction to an unfolding, unprecedented existential threat. After all, it makes sense to get anxious when the World Bank predicts that 140 million climate refugees will be on the move, migrating in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia by 2050, while other official estimates have put that number at over 1 billion. And it's perfectly appropriate to get worried that increased migration will elevate the risk of violence and war. And it's suitable to feel stressed when scientists say that 1 to 3 billion people will be living by the end of the century outside of the temperature niche that has allowed human civilization to thrive over the last 6,000 years. And it's normal to get nervous when a scientific report says that the Greenlandic ice sheet has melted beyond a point of no return, as one recently did. So you get the picture. We don't need to go on, but the sense is that there is nothing to be medicalized about feeling this kind of anxiety. It means that you are in touch with the world. It's a badge of your humanity. It's a token of your connection. It's the fact that you are awake and feeling things that are truly unraveling. And that's why when we look at it from this sense, despite the pop culture term that has now taken over, eco-anxiety, which seems to bring a lot of people into the space of thinking about disorder, we see that it's really a sense of eco-empathy that we are talking about. And as a result, the climate-aware therapist Rosemary Randall argues that we should really be calling it eco-distress rather than anxiety, because this is not reserved for a particular subset of the population. And it's something, honestly, to feel proud of feeling. That people who are feeling eco-anxious often sense that they have to hold on to immense existential pressure all by themselves, because generally, though things are changing, permissions are now starting to be made, it still isn't mainstream and in terms of being socially acceptable and normative to talk about one's experiences with eco-anxiety. You know, if you're a kid and you're going to school, pre-pandemic, when you were going to school, let's say, the adults at school aren't usually talking about it. If you're an adult with your colleagues, your friends, it's not really a topic that your friends are bringing up and normalizing. And so it's grief that is not recognized. And this can make the pain a lot harder to deal with. You know, when we have another kind of loss, a human loss, we have socially accepted norms of grieving, wakes, funerals, Shiva allow us to get the social supports that we require in what are profoundly disorienting times. But when we're mourning a glacier, or, you know, the loss of a mountaintop or a species, there are still no concrete social supports built into the fabric of everyday life to help us find the reorientation that we need. And we're all part of the work of creating those norms that we need so that we can usher through these times and positively transform them. Coping is challenging in the planetary health crisis that we're in. You know, we need to find ways of living with a life-threatening situation that cannot be eliminated in the short term and perhaps can never be completely overcome. At the same time, we need to really get in tune with our capacity to accept uncertainty and mortality and integrate dark emotions into our lives around ecological change rather than just try to banish them or paper over them. So it's a tough task that we're being faced with when we're trying to cope with eco-anxiety. But the first thing that can be the most distributing of the pain and therefore most relieving is to connect with others who can mirror your feelings, who give permission to them, who show you that there's nothing abject or strange about feeling them, and, you know, finding yourself in that space of really leaning into the normalcy and the compassion that's involved with feeling eco-anxious. Now, there's a lot of innovative solutions that are arising around how we can do that. One example is the Good Grief Network. They offer an online 10-step program inspired by Alcoholics Anonymous to usher people through an entire charted emotional trajectory according to their various steps, so that people can, by the end of it, reinvest the emotional energy that they have lost by grieving and feeling anxious into life-affirming, meaningful actions. It can be, you know, your typical political activist kind of orientation, or it can be something absolutely, that does not look like that. The point is that they're trying to get you to do something that is meaningful to you and to your community. Allowing me to plug my last slide, which is my newsletter, and perhaps you're already on it. Perhaps that's how you found out about this webinar, but if you're not, that's how you can keep in touch with me and my research as it's unfolding in this area. It comes out once a week, and otherwise you can keep your eyes out for my book in 2022 called Generation Dread, as opposed to just the shorter Gen Dread. But yeah, really, this was an absolute privilege and an honor to be with you. And thank you to everyone who asked questions and shared resources. It's really nice to be in community who's thinking so, intentionally about the state of the world that we're in.